Hello there. We are in Christian marriage, week 7 out of 8. So, you as students are almost done with this course. This is the 15th of July, the lecture for July 15th. I wanted to make sure that you have turned in the presentation, the presentation um, that is due for those of you who have done presentations. Uh, make sure that you have completed those by the end of the 15th. The rest of the assignments will be due next week uh, by the end of the 22nd. Contact me with any questions about that. In addition to that, uh, you'll be taking a final exam, and I will provide more information that uh, for that between now and the day that you take it. Again, continue to contact me if you have any questions. We're going to be concluding our discussion of the Balswick book today. And before we do that, I want to talk to you about another source that comes from the book Staying Close. Dennis Rainey um, and his wife have done a lot of material dealing with the purpose of marriage, the plan of marriage. They do conferences, a lot of helpful material. And Staying Close is one of those resources. And on page 248 and 249, they provide 5 tips for the area of conflict. 5 tips for the area of conflict. Last session, we talked about communication. Conflict is one aspect of communication, but we're going to focus on conflict as a whole today. This again is taught from a Christian standpoint. So we're not talking about just outright conflict with no rules. We're talking about conflict with understanding, conflict with appropriate behavior. So what I want to talk to you first about is the Rainey material regarding the 5 tips for a confrontation. The first tip is to check your motivation. To check your motivation means to ask yourself why. Why am I bothering with this conflict? Is it important? Is it necessary? Am I doing this to only make myself look better or to be able to say I'm right at the end of it? Or am I trying to better the relationship? Is this conflict worth it? In other words, what is my motive, to help or to hurt? They also suggest to check your attitude. Check your attitude as you go in to the conflict. Am I going in from a standpoint of love? Am I going in from a standpoint of respect? Or am I looking down upon the other person with whom I disagree? Very important to note. The third tip is to check the circumstances, primarily talking about the timing and the location or setting. The timing and location or setting. Conflict needs to be handled well. Now, there's some conflict that's going to be spur of the moment and it needs to be dealt with then. But when we're talking about conflict as a whole, particularly if it's one where there's anticipation, in other words, I'm thinking through how am I going to address this situation with my spouse or my friend or with whomever, this conflict needs to be dealt with well. And the timing, therefore, is important. So I don't want to engage in conflict when there is a lot of fatigue. I don't want to engage in conflict where there's busyness or chaos. I don't want to engage in conflict when it's just a bad time. There's a better time to do this. Another category there is location. How private is the setting? How public is the setting? How serious the conflict? Am I conflicting over what to order in a nice way at a restaurant? Probably okay. An issue that we need to deal with in marriage, probably not okay. One of the statements made in the Staying Close book is that never criticize, make fun, or argue with your mate in public. Never criticize, make fun, or argue with your mate in public. It's a good rule of thumb. Fourth thing to keep in mind from the idea of the tips, and that is what other pressures may be present. If you're parents of young children, you understand this, or you remember when maybe you're not sleeping as well. Maybe there's complications with the whole understand of how to raise a child. We need to understand what's going on. Did someone just have a long day at work, or just get laid off from their work, or someone having health issues, someone hungry? What are the pressures that you're facing at the time? In Alaska, for example, as you can see outside of sun and green, Alaska has a lot of darkness in the winter, and we have to keep that in consideration when we talk about, is it just a cold and dreary day? Maybe someone's acting differently because it's cold and dreary versus bright and sunny. The fifth tip that they provide is to be sure you're ready to take it as you dish it out. Those terms may be a little harsh, but we know what they're trying to get to is, if I'm coming and I want to say, here's an issue I think I need to deal with, if someone then turns around, your spouse says, understand where you're coming from, hear me out, or here, while we're talking about that is another issue I think we need to address while we're in this conversation. You can't just be one-sided in it. So make sure. So again, those 5 tips are: check your motive, check your attitude, check the circumstances, be aware of other pressures around, and be sure you're ready to take it as well as dish it out. In chapter 10 of the Baldwick book, which begins on page 118, they cover the subject of conflict. One of the things that they say there at the beginning, quoting from Carl Whitaker, is conflict is the fertilizer of life. If you're a conflict avoider, if you just don't like conflict, that statement may not sit well with you. But conflict does indeed bring about growth when handled well. It can bring about destruction, but it can bring about growth. And so the point there being that conflict is necessary for growth. Think of education. There's a conflict in essence that I have to take a test. I have to rearrange my schedule so I have time to study or to write a paper. There's this conflict of time. There's the decision-making process. There's conflict of different types. And we're going to go through some of that. But first of all, realize that conflict is necessary for growth. On page 118, it says, if a couple claims never to have conflicts, we can make one of several assumptions. 1, they haven't been married very long. 2, they don't talk to each other very much. And 3, the spouse has all the power and the other has none. Or 4, they are in denial. So conflict is going to happen. There are things that we can see in our own relationships and in the relationships of others to see if we are handling conflict well. So as we look through this chapter and look at this whole idea of conflict, I think a good question to keep in mind is, how well do I engage in conflict? Not do I have it, we all have it, but how well do I engage in it? Page 119, when we're talking about a biblical perspective, because again, if you're going to have conflict in a Christian marriage, it needs to be done in a Christian manner or a biblical manner, or specifically a Christ-like manner. Philippians 2, 1 Corinthians 13. And we talk about this, letting our attitude be that of Christ Jesus. The whole understanding of Jesus faced conflict, and Jesus even engaged in conflict and even started conflict because of he needed to teach people. He needed to reach out to people. And that was necessary for spiritual growth and for the growth of the kingdom of God. Page 119, it says this: assuming that a marriage reflects Trinitarian relationality, scriptural passages such as Ephesians 4:26 provides practical wisdom on the subject. To be angry, the emotion, it's not a sin, but how you deal with negative expression of anger in a relational conflict can be a sin. This should persuade spouses to see their emotions as a powerful signal alerting them that something is wrong between them. Only when they pay attention, only when we pay attention, can we bring about change. Jesus displayed anger in response to sin and injustice. Righteous anger helps us right the wrongs in our world and our relationships. Accepting anger as a God given emotion gives us cause to attend to our feelings in a constructive manner. That may not sit well at first hearing. If you're a person who embraces conflict and has learned to do so well, you can read that, listen to that, think, well, that makes sense. If you're a person that really does not like conflict, the idea that there is even such a thing as righteous anger or good conflict can sound strange. But as the Baldwicks have done, is you point to Jesus, who went, for example, to Pharisees and called them out on the things they were doing that were leading the people, sheep, astray, leading them away from the truth of God as revealed in the Old Testament, and as Jesus was revealing him in the time period of the New Testament. He did not shy away from conflict. He wasn't always nice. You think of the word nice, often that its connotation of I'm just getting along with everybody. But the problem with that is sometimes that takes away the truthfulness of the situation. Take the marriage example again, or an example in marriage, since that's the topic. If your spouse says, "Are you okay?" and you're very frustrated about something within your marriage, and you simply say yes because you want to avoid conflict, you haven't dealt with it. It's unfair to your spouse because you're holding something against them. It's unfair to you because you're not dealing with the emotion in a proper way, and it's not honoring God. It doesn't mean we need to air all our laundry, as they say. It doesn't mean I need to bring up everything that might be an annoyance, but it does mean that we need to be honest with the way we feel with our spouse, and for that matter, with everybody with whom we have a relationship of any value. And so we look at this and say that not only is it appropriate when handled well, but it says here to be angry is not a sin, but how you deal with negative expression of anger in a relational conflict can be sin. I think that's so important for us to realize that it can easily lead to sin. We go back to the rainy considerations of the circumstances and the attitude and the motivation. If we look at those and say, well, my motivation was really to be right, or my motivation was to really make sure that they know they're wrong, that's going to be sin. That's not going to be an anger that is righteous. It's not going to be a conflict that's appropriate. And we can see this in obvious ways sometimes in our relationships and especially in our communication. On page 120, there are words given at the very bottom that talk about psychological mechanisms are ways people learn to ignore angry feelings. So those are the ones I'm going to talk about, those particular psychological mechanisms to ignore angry feelings. One is denial, pretending there's no problem when there is one. Pretending is not going to do anybody any good in a relationship, unless we're playing make believe as a game or something. But this idea of nothing's wrong, when in fact there is. One of my favorite phrases is no worries, no worries. That is appropriate sometimes, but other times it's not. When we need to say there really is an issue, I think we need to deal with this, not just deny the issue. I've often talked to couples as they prepare for marriage. In fact, every wedding that I do, I require that because I think it's so important that we start off right and have a healthy platform on which to build a marriage based upon Christ and love for one another. And I use the example of a toothpaste tube and say that sometimes people get divorced over a toothpaste tube. It's an illustration to tell people that while some of you may be folks that squeeze from the end, some of you may twist, that can be just an annoyance that you don't squeeze or you don't twist the toothpaste the way I do. Now, does anybody really get divorced because of toothpaste? No, I don't believe so. But there are divorces that happen around things like that, that where the toothpaste is the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. In other words, there have been years of issues or months of issues, and I haven't brought it up. I've denied they're there. And then one morning I see the toothpaste in a way that I wish it weren't there, the tube, and I just blow my top. And I think, well, this person doesn't care about me. This person doesn't love me. How dare they not appreciate me and not do the toothpaste I want the way I want them to do toothpaste? And they begin to break down, not because of toothpaste, not because of the tube, not because of some habit or lack of cleanliness, but because of unresolved conflict, undealt with, unacknowledged even conflict. So the first mechanism, not positive here, but first mechanism pointed out, psychological mechanism, is denial. The second is that of displacement. You express anger to the wrong person. Not, I am not condoning this, but for purpose of illustration, the old phrase, you go home and kick the dog because of the day at work. Don't kick your dog. But the idea of I'm angry with my spouse and therefore I'm snippy with my kids. It's not my kid's fault. It's not the dog's fault. It's not your spouse's fault that your employer was difficult to get along with today. This is the illustration here. You take one and shift it to another person. The other is disengagement. You're separating yourself from anger. You can't play with my toys, in other words, that kindergarten game. It's I'm frustrated with you, therefore I'm just going to go away from you. I'm going to walk away, maybe even pretend you're not there, ignore you, whatever it may be. That I'm just going to disengage, and this can be a very dangerous thing because this is where couples feel like we're in the same room, but we're really not in the same room, and we've known each other, but it doesn't seem like we know each other right now. There's a disengagement because something hasn't been dealt with well. And the fourth mechanism expressed here on page 120 is the disqualification. And this is discounting anger by minimizing it. This is similar to no worries, but no worries is really just saying there are no worries that are evident. In other words, really, there's nothing wrong at all. The disqualification is saying, yes, there's an issue, but it's not that big of an issue, even though in your mind you're thinking it is a big issue. This can be everything from toothpaste tubes to smacking food to choices of entertainment to choice of the words we use to how much our in our marriage relationships is intimacy something that is helpful to both spouses, or is it selfish for one? Is the time? Think of the love languages. Is the time actually quality time? Are the gifts actually heartfelt? Is the act of service done so that you'll be served, or is it actually a genuine act of service? These type of things can seem small, but they're actually bigger, and they need to be dealt with. I go on to talk about conflicts in couples and ways in which we see how couples deal with it. And there's really three common conflict couple types, they call it. Three common conflict couple types. It's on page 122 and following. And the first one is a volatile. Volatile couples value openness and honesty and are emotionally expressive. Since they express both positive and negative emotions, a relationship can be emotionally volatile. But when there is a strong ratio of positive and negative emotions expressed, volatile couples are usually able to grow through their conflict. Volatile. When I hear the word, I think of explosive or reactional, but they're not using the word in that way. They're using it just as more open, more expressive, again, as I said, in positive, negative way, but not in a destructive way, but in a way that says, we're going to deal with this. We're going to celebrate big, and we're going to have conflict big in the sense of we're going to do it well. We're not going to hide our feelings. And that is one method. The other is validating. And it says more moderate in their emotional expressions of the validating couples. Validating couples are use softening techniques, bring up a disagreement, are sensitive to their spouse's feelings and focus on the good of the relationship. This seems to me to be a very healthy style. It's the one my wife and I try to use. And it's a lot of verbiage where you can say, it seems to me that there's something that we need to deal with in our marriage. Or can you help me understand why you fill in the blank? Can you help me understand why you are doing this in a way that you haven't done before? Or I really would like to talk to you about something, but when is a good time to talk about that? Or I'm feeling like there's some distance between us. Is there something that I'm doing that's causing that? Can we talk about this? So notice the humility with these type of statements, not you are making me angry. You can have that same conversation beginning with, I'm feeling angry right now, and I'd like to talk to you about that. Listen to that. I'm feeling angry right now, and I'd like to talk about that, versus you make me angry. The conversation will go in two separate directions depending on the very first statements spoken. I'm sad versus our relationship is a wreck. These type of statements can really change the way, the trajectory of conversations, and even ultimately the trajectory of relationships. And then the conflict avoiding. It says the third pattern identified as a conflict avoiding couple. If conflicts are not avoided altogether, they're addressed in low key fashion. It's not that avoiding is always a bad thing, but avoiding where it's never dealt with is definitely unhealthy. In the middle of page 123, one statement to point out there. It says removing oneself from the intense emotional energy opens the way to thoughtful reflection. So regardless of the ways in which people choose to deal with conflict, it's good to have time to reflect, to step back, to think about it. I think in the interpersonal relationships in technology, I've often told folks in my congregation and friends that before they push send on an email or push that on the text, to think about what you've just written, to delete if necessary, to think about, is this going to have the impact? Going back to what we were talking about earlier, what's my motivation? What's my attitude in this? Is it Christ-like? Is it love in God's, in the biblical definition of love? Is it loving in the way that I'm sharing this word? They have these rules on page 124. I think they're good rules. They are from Peter Wyden's book, and George Bach. And these may be good to post if you're a person who tends to fight dirty, in the sense of you're not a maniac of any type, but you just have not really learned well. Maybe you had a bad example of that. Maybe you didn't have any example, and so you're just making it up as you go along. But what are the rules? You think of some of you are in the military, and many of the Wayland students are. If you are, again, thank you for your service. But many of you in military, perhaps you have been or still are. And even in warfare, there are rules. There are, in fact, great penalties if a nation uses warfare methods that the world considers brutal. You're all aware of the trials that came after the Great Second War. You think of the times where we even as a country have debated, have we gone too far in interrogation, for example? When can we engage with in another nation? What was the crime committed? Is it our business being there? All these conversations go on within the military system, and there are rules even within war. Well, think about that statement. In literal war, there are even rules within war to fight fairly. Now, bring it down to the small, much smaller issue between a husband and a wife, not nation against nation or tribe against tribe or whatever. But you have a husband and a wife, and there need to be rules, because it's not a win-lose. Because as I said in marriage, if it's win lose, one person is winning and one person is losing. And if you win, you are making your spouse a loser. And who wants to make the spouse a loser? No one who's thinking in the right mind. It always needs to be winner, winner, not you always agree. It's we are better in our relationship. We're growing our relationship because we're acknowledging our differences. We're discussing these things to help us grow in a relationship. And so, what are those rules? One issue only. It's oh, I thought of this. Oh, I thought you drive me. Oh, I drive you crazy this. Well, you drive me crazy doing this. You smack. Well, you you make noises. Whatever it may be, stick to the point. Number two, choose a time and place. It goes back to location and setting. Be prepared. Uh, I love bring proper attitude as a part of that as well. Um, the past is the past. Corinthians 13 says, love does not keep a record of wrongs. So this is what they're hammering on here. Can't bring it up. Spouse says, I'm feeling sad because of the way I see you handling the situation. And the first response is, well, that's what you did last year. That's not letting the past be the past. It's evidence of not forgiving, and there needs to be forgiveness. The no surprise punches, emotion laden areas are off limits. No surprise punches. We're not here to fight in the sense of harm. No hitting below the belt. No hitting, period. But what they're using is the sensitive areas divert the issue. In other words, uh, be gentle, but be one who's aiming at the issue and not the things that we know can be digs. You're familiar with the word dig in the area of conflict. No digs, in other words. Don't dismiss. They may say, your spouse may say that he or she is troubled about something. You say, well, it's no big deal. As soon as you say it's no big deal, what you're saying to them is your feelings are not something I can validate. And you've chosen to be in a relationship with this person and you love that person. And therefore to say, well, your feelings don't matter, even though you would not say those words, to laugh at something they consider serious can be very damaging and hurtful to them and to your relationship. No why questions allowed. Now, I need to explain this a little bit uh, because it's the sense that we not everything has to be asked. It's not a it's not just digging it all up. It's more of a treasure hunt. It's what are we finding? And so we need to think about motivation. And if there's been a great hurt, there needs to be some why questions. But this idea of blame or accusation often lies behind the why questions. This how also similar to why. How could you have ever done that? That's it's not a why question, but at the heart of it, um, that's not a question you want to ask. It's let's talk through this together. Uh, and then dyad versus triad, don't get a third person involved. Uh, Women don't bring your friend in um, and have a conversation just to have somebody on your side by that. And men, same thing for you. If you're going to the gym, you're going hunting, you go whatever. Um, you don't want to sit there and badmouth your wife. You want to talk to God about it. That's the best triad. But this dyad, this it's a conflict between two people. You need to stay there. Now, this doesn't mean you don't ever reach out for counseling. This doesn't mean you don't talk to a confidant about it, a friend who is truly going to be able to tell you the truth. Don't just talk to a person who's going to agree with you, not just a person who's going to say you're right, your spouse is silly or worse, but to say, could you give me some good feedback? And that's if you and your spouse have started to deal with it and you're at a roadblock. You know, it's not if you think of the idea of tag team and take wrestling for example or boxing. If you have two boxers and one boxer is getting tired, they bring another boxer and have two against one. That's not a fair fight, and so it's got to be two, not three. And then don't ridicule, no put downs, no name calling. If someone is told a lie, they're not a liar. They're a person who's told a lie. If a person is not being helpful around the house, they're not a lazy person. They may be a person who's been lazy for too long of a time, but they're not a lazy person, a person who's being lazy. Uh, Veto power, signal technical error when rules are broken. If you establish rules ahead of time, you say, whoa, whoa, we said no hitting below the belt. We said no name calling. And I appreciate if you stick with the rules because you just called me a name. Again, said in love, but in a firm manner, not in an angry manner, but in a, oh, you've hurt me in this. So, or I'm hurt, right, better. I'm hurt by the fact that you broke this rule that we agreed upon. And then 12, break at the end of each round in the sense of, let's just don't turn this into all day argument session, all day conflict session. Have a time to do this. I would say here as well, to be very intentional, to separate date time, intimate time, special time with each other, with organized conflict time. When it comes to this topic, I always think of a conversation I had. This has now been several years ago. A couple in our church, they had a big anniversary weekend, and they went to a special place, and I was excited for them. I talked to the husband. He was excited about a time away with his wife, and he came back, and I asked him how it was, and he said, well, Mark, I got some advice for you. I said, what's that? And he said, well, when you go on a trip like this, don't ever talk about how you disagree with finances. The trip was basically ruined because they got into a conversation that turned into an argument that wasn't handled well about finances. And while they had a getaway weekend, a couple nights at a romantic spot, there wasn't much romance because the mood was killed because of the choice of conversation. Uh, what if that comes up? What if you're on a drive to a date? What if you're in the middle of a date and you're out to dinner and there's a conversation about what's next? Maybe it's going to be too expensive. Maybe it's whatever. You can say, can we talk about that on Monday? Or can we talk about that tomorrow? In other words, I'm not going to ignore you. I don't want to talk about it, but let's enjoy this time together. That's a thing, a method, a methodology, a technique to help us say, I care enough about you and about this issue that we're going to talk about it. Keep me on my word on this, but let's enjoy this time together. Let's make sure our dating is healthy. Let's make sure our romance is healthy and not let conflict derail the whole thing. From 126 to 131, there are different conflict styles, and you've read that. If you have not, make sure you do to dig into this. But I want to look at the understanding, kind of the prerequisite for the rest of this, the understanding of these styles. It says there's no perfect conflict style. Let's top of page 127. There's no perfect conflict style. In fact, we'll give examples from the life of Jesus to indicate how he used all 5 styles. Each style has aspects that may hinder achieving what the couple wants. While some persons use the same conflict style in all situations, others vary their styles according to the circumstance. It's better not to get locked into one style, but most likely each spouse has an immediate preference for one style. Spouse will need to be adaptable so they can take advantage of what works best in their marriage. We are looking for combined styles that keep relationship connection while having open dialogue so the couple can reach a satisfying conclusion. Notice again, no perfect conflict style. In fact, Jesus had various conflict style. You think of his conflict with the Pharisees when he's talking about their hypocritical behavior versus his response to the woman caught in adultery. In both places, he recognizes that sin is a hurtful thing, that she and the missing man who should have been there as well both sinned. And Jesus doesn't make light of that, but he sensitively deals with it. And in the same story, he's talking to these hypocritical people who are ready to stone her, not recognizing their own sin. And so even in the same story, he's confronting a group of people, the stone throwing people, or at least stone in hand, thankfully not throwing yet. He's using one style in them and the other style on the woman who's caught in adultery. Or think about the way in which he spoke to his disciples. sometimes very gently in a come and follow me, and other times this rebuke of get behind me, Satan, or go and do what you must do, or why are you worrying? Why could you not even stay awake? Or why were you worrying when the seas were in turmoil? He has different conflict styles, and he overlaps them and interchanges them. And we need to learn from that. And I encourage you to look through these five styles: the winner, resolver, compromiser, withdrawer, yielder, times to deal with that. It's important to know, even again, back to the life of Jesus, there were times where to continue a conversation of conflict was not necessary. His trial before Pilate, for example, he didn't say much. There were times he remained silent, and his silence spoke more than words. Very, very important for us to think about. We go on to chapter 11, and they talk about the seasons of marriage. The seasons of marriage. On page 137, you see quite an extensive list of the seasons of marriage. And if you're married, you can look at this and see uh, where you are in this. And they are not, this is not Bible. In other words, this is not 100% accurate all the time, but it's helpful information. To back up there a little bit, second paragraph says circumstances have a way of bringing surprises and challenges to marriage, requiring an ongoing revision of dreams and goals. Through the shifting realities of each stage, it's the marital bond that provides a solid foundation for entering a new stage with imaginative possibilities. It goes on to talk about unexpected realities. Some can be expected and some unexpected. And for example, if a person says 10 years into marriage where there's a child, maybe two, and there's been job adjustments and even some physical changes, if they're expecting a marriage that's just like the honeymoon phase, there's going to be disappointment. Now, there should be some of the things that are present in honeymoon stage. There still should be physical intimacy and words of expression of love and a time and commitment with each other. But if it's exactly the same, then either there's been no growth or not much change in life, and change is always happening. Or the phase my wife and I are going to enter in soon, here actually in just over a month, our youngest is going to go off to college. So we have three now grown children, and our youngest is going to go off to college at the end of August. And so we're going to enter the proverbial empty nest syndrome. My father-in-law recently passed away, and so that's another stage of what's it like to lose a parent. We have to work with each other on this. Uh, my wife was gone more because she was going to go visit her parents when her dad was sick and her mom was having some other health issues. And so that adjustment of just being used to her being gone more, and to bless that and to encourage that. I know when our kids were little and she needed to travel, it was more difficult because there were things that made it more difficult with the work and making sure that the kids were tended to in the way they needed to. But then it becomes easier to travel as the kids get older. Uh, then later on, as parents are ill, do they live with you as a couple? And if so, you may have been empty nesters, but now you have people back in the house that aren't children, but they're other adults with strong opinions, etc. How do marriages navigate this? And so there are seasons. And if you look again at the table 11.1 on page 137, you can see that there are lots of stages mentioned, and it is important for us to be aware of those potential changes. Now, one will not apply to everyone. So, for example, thankfully, not all marriages end in divorce. So, the divorce, remarriage, and remarriage is not necessarily going to be everybody's experience. Uh, but we can learn from all these experiences that apply to us. You have the honeymoon marriage as addressed on page 138. And one thing I want to point out there that I think is very important for us to acknowledge is the danger of unrealistic expectations. It says researchers find that unrealistic expectations may be one of the most devastating blows to early marriage. That's why I require and suggest for others who don't have me do a service, suggest pre-marriage counseling to get some of those issues talked about. To say this is important for me to talk about, important for us to talk about. Now, we can't predict all of those things, and so whether it be what our communication styles are going to be like, or how often we will be intimate with one another, or uh, how many kids we want to have, or what do we do in sticky situations, troubling situations. Are we ready for those experiences? And they can be difficult. On page 140, it talks about the idea of investing uh, in family in the right proportion. It says investing so much time and energy as parents is sometimes done at the expense of their marital relationship. So it's important that my mom, this is almost a soapbox for my wife and I, that so important to date your spouse. So important to date your spouse, even when you have kids. This idea of I have to spend all my time with my children, or the majority of it, and neglect my spouse. That's a dangerous path to go. So I challenge you, if you are losing touch with your spouse because you're spending so much time with your children, continue to love your children, spend time with your children, make sure you're dating your spouse. Along those lines, they talk about the debate over discipline. To what degree do we discipline? To what things are important to discipline? How do we do that? Very serious conversations need to be taken there. And then on page 144, there are issues of the um, four stages of separation. I think it's important for people to realize that in marriages that do fail, that there are stages in that. And so that's important information, hopefully not needed. But we look at the statistics, and uh, divorce is reality in our world. And so even when that happens, it needs to be dealt with in as healthy as a manner as possible. One of the things that I think would be very important for you to be familiar with, on chapter 14, there are some issues in regard to the marital spirituality. And on page 181, I'll go ahead and turn there in my book. On page 181, it talked about marital spirituality, and it talks about the 10 disciplines. This is on page 181. So I encourage you to look in to that page and be aware of those disciplines, because those will be helpful. We want to obviously read the chapter as well, but one topic I'd want you to be aware of and to know more information about is the 10 disciplines as listed there on page 181. So that concludes our session 7. We do have another week, but this is the final lecture session. I will perhaps record another videos for some closing comments, but for sure be working on those assignments and get them done by the end of the 22nd, which is the final week of class. I do want to add this. I have been teaching this uh, as Dr. Goodman, my role at Wayland Baptist University as an adjunct instructor. And I hope you have found this helpful. And we've needed to do this on an academic level, because that's the purpose of this course. As I have told you from week 1, I'm teaching this from a Christian perspective in a Christian university, and I myself am a Christian. I myself am a follower of Jesus. I myself too am a father, am a husband, and I'm a pastor. So now I want to come to you for just a moment as Pastor Mark, as a person who has been married 29 years, who has 3 adult children, and who pastors a church. And that to say that if you'd like to talk about any of this issue from a ministerial standpoint, if there's some concerns you have within your own marriage, or some things that you'd like to talk about in regard to others you're going to be talking about, particularly those of you going into ministry, feel free to reach out to me uh, in in a in a different mode after the 22nd, because as a part of this role as Dr. Goodman, I need to be able to uh, judge your work, grade your work, uh, give you a grade, and then after 22nd, would greatly be able to continue this conversation, but not for a grade. So I just want to offer that to you if that's something that you need to get some resources on. Obviously, if you are a minister yourself, you can do the same for other people. And if you're plugged into a local congregation, make sure that you avail yourself of all the resources your church place of worship offers as well, because marriage is that valuable. It's why Wayland has this course. It's why the Bible talks about the value of love between a man and a woman. And I encourage you to continue to make this a priority. Thank you again for your time. And I ask blessings upon you as you continue your journey in education. God bless you.